somewhere in the salt-stung lagoons of northeastern Italy. A city built on water and secrets held in its vaults the intelligence that determined which empires lived and which empires crumbled. And for 500 years, almost no one knew it existed. Venice did not conquer the world with armies. It conquered the world with information.
Most
With
serene
whispers
prince, I
passed
present the
through marble
relazione.
corridors,
We receive it with
with
gratitude.
coded dispatches riding the backs of merchant ships, with ambassadors who were trained spies long before any nation understood what a spy truly was. And the system they built was so ruthlessly efficient, so architecturally perfect in its paranoia, that it would not be matched until the rise of the modern intelligence state more than 4 centuries later. If you are genuinely fascinated by history and you want more stories like this, stories that crack open the secret machinery beneath civilization, smash that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know if this channel reaches Lahore, Lagos, London, or Lima. And tell me what topic you want me to cover next. Should I go deeper into the Ottoman intelligence networks, the Medici banking espionage, the British East India Company's information wars? Your comment decides the next script. Before Venice existed, before any of the marble palaces rose from the mud, before any Doge wore his ceremonial cap, before a single galley cut the Adriatic with Venetian colors, the land that would birth history's greatest information empire was barely land at all. The Veneti, an Indo-European people who arrived in northeastern Italy around 1000 BCE, settled the terra firma, the mainland fringes of what would become the Venetian hinterland. And they were traders from the very beginning, moving amber down from the Baltic, horses across the Po Plain, and information between cultures that barely understood each other. They built no great pyramids and carved no legendary inscriptions, but they possessed something more durable than stone monuments. They understood that knowledge of what lay beyond the next hill was worth more than any sword. When Rome absorbed them in the 1st century BCE and made them citizens, the Veneti did not vanish. They adapted. They absorbed Roman commercial law, Roman roads, Roman communication networks, and they filed it all away. Then, in the 5th century CE, as the Hunnic storms of Attila swept down from the steppes and Roman civilization began its long unwinding, the people of the Veneto coast did something extraordinary. They retreated not into mountains or forests, but into the sea itself, building settlements on islands and mudflats that no cavalry could reach, in a lagoon that was too shallow for warships and too complex for anyone who had not grown up navigating its invisible channels. And it was in this geographic impossibility, this city on water, that the greatest intelligence operation in pre-modern history was born. Though it would take centuries before anyone recognized what was truly being constructed, the foundation story of Venice is the foundation story of an intelligence state in embryo. in 697 CE, a date that Venetian chroniclers would later circle with reverence. The scattered island communities of the lagoon elected their first Doge, a word derived from the Latin dux, meaning leader or duke. The man they chose was Pauluccio Anafsto, and his election was not merely a political act, but an architectural one. It was the first time these water-bound communities agreed to share information, to pool their knowledge of the sea lanes, the currents, the positions of rivals, and the movements of enemies under a single coordinating authority. The early doges were not kings in the absolute sense. Venice would never tolerate a king, for kings kept secrets from their subjects, while Venice built its power on the exact opposite principle. The state must know everything, and the state must control what everyone else knows. The lagoon itself was the first intelligence advantage Venice ever possessed. To navigate into the city from the open Adriatic, you needed a pilot, a local guide who knew which channels were deep enough for your hull and which would ground you in sucking mud. The Venetians made this practical necessity into a political instrument from the very earliest decades of the Republic. Foreign ships entering the harbor were always guided by Venetian pilots, men who were also trained observers, who noted the cargo, counted the sailors, identified the accents, and reported everything they saw to the Doge's household before the foreign merchants had finished tying their mooring ropes. The genius of this system was that it looked like hospitality. Every foreign captain appreciated the assistance. None of them understood they had just been processed by an intelligence apparatus. By the 9th century, Venice occupied an almost miraculous geopolitical position. It nominally owed allegiance to the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, which gave its merchants extraordinary access to Eastern trade networks, to the spice routes, the silk roads, the perfume markets of the Levant. But it also maintained commercial relationships with the Lombard kingdoms of northern Italy, with the Frankish Empire of Charlemagne, and with the Arab caliphates that controlled the southern Mediterranean. This meant that Venetian merchants were the one group of people who moved freely between civilizations that were technically hostile to each other. And every journey they made was simultaneously a trading expedition and an intelligence-gathering mission. A Venetian cloth merchant sitting in a Cairo coffeehouse in 880 CE was not merely buying pepper. He was listening to conversations about the Abbasid caliph's military preparations, the price fluctuations that signaled grain shortages, the political tensions that might disrupt the next season's caravan routes. And he was composing in his head the report he would deliver when he returned to the lagoon. The cultural achievement of this era was not in stone or bronze, but in the architecture of memory. The Venetians developed, through necessity and genius, one of the earliest systematic approaches to commercial record-keeping in medieval Europe. Their fondaci, the trading houses they established in Constantinople, Alexandria, and other major cities, were not merely warehouses. They were data collection centers, staffed by Venetian nationals who maintained meticulous records of prices, political events, military movements, and commercial opportunities. The information gathered at these fondi flowed back to Venice through a courier system that was, by the standards of the 9th century, almost incomprehensibly well organized. Regular ships, scheduled departures, sealed dispatches, and a receiving office in the ducal palace, where clerks cataloged every report and filed it in a growing archive that, over generations, became the most comprehensive database of Mediterranean commercial and political intelligence anywhere in the world. The Doge who crystallized this emerging system into something approaching formal policy was Pietro Tradonico, who ruled from 836 to 864 CE and became the first Venetian leader to treat diplomatic contact with foreign powers as an explicitly information-gathering exercise rather than merely a ceremonial obligation. Tradonico sent envoys to the Frankish court, not primarily to negotiate treaties, but to observe, to study how Carolingian administrators organized their revenues, how they communicated across their vast territory, what they feared and what they wanted. The envoys came back with reports that were part diplomatic summary, part economic analysis, and part intelligence assessment. And Tradonico used these reports to position Venice as an indispensable intermediary in every negotiation between East and West. But the price of being indispensable is that everyone wants to eliminate you. And in 864 CE, Pietro Tradonico was assassinated in the church of San Zaccaria, killed by rivals who understood that the man who controls information controls everything, and decided they would rather destroy the controller than submit to him. Yet the assassination of Pietro Tradonico did not end the system he had helped to build. It accelerated it. The lesson the Venetian political class drew from his murder was not that information was dangerous. It was that insufficient control of information was dangerous. If Tradonico had known what his rivals were planning, he would have survived. The logical conclusion was to build a system that knew everything. This conclusion, drawn in the dark aftermath of a bloody church floor in 864 CE, was the seed from which the Council of Ten and all its apparatus would eventually grow. Though the harvest would not come for another 4 centuries, with the establishment of the Doge's authority and the refinement of the fondi system, the stage was cleared for Venice's explosive expansion into something the world had never quite seen before. A commercial empire built not on conquered territory, but on controlled information corridors. It was at this moment, as the first millennium turned, and Christian Europe began its great convulsion of religious energy that would send armies marching toward Jerusalem, that Venice made the most audacious strategic calculation in its history. While French knights were sharpening their swords with genuine religious fervor, and while German emperors were calculating territorial gains in the Holy Land. The Doge Pietro II Orsiolo, ruling from 991 to 1009 CE, made a decision that revealed everything about how Venice understood power. He would profit from the crusading impulse without being consumed by it. And he would do so by becoming the indispensable carrier of information between all the competing parties in 1000 CE. In a ceremony so theatrical that it seems almost designed for posterity, Orsiolo sailed out of the lagoon and across the Adriatic to assert Venetian dominance over the Dalmatian coast, not through massacre, but through a series of negotiations in which local communities agreed to Venetian oversight in exchange for protection and commercial access. He returned to Venice with tribute and with something more valuable, an unbroken chain of informants along the entire eastern Adriatic coastline, every one of them reporting to Venice about shipping movements, political developments, and military preparations by the Byzantine, Croatian, and Serbian powers operating in the region. The Crusades transformed Venice's intelligence operations from a sophisticated commercial practice into something approaching a state science. When Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade in 1095, Venice did not immediately send armies. It sent observers. Venetian agents were present at the Council of Clermont, listening to the responses of the assembled nobility, calculating which lords had the most men and the least money, identifying the combinations that would make them dependent on Venetian shipping. When the Crusader armies began their march east in 1096, they discovered an uncomfortable truth. They had no ships capable of crossing the Mediterranean in the necessary numbers, and the one maritime power with both the fleet capacity and the navigational knowledge to carry them was Venice. The price Venice extracted for this service was not merely money. It was information. Every Crusader commander who boarded a Venetian ship agreed, explicitly or implicitly, to share his intelligence about conditions in the Holy Land, about the defenses of cities, about the dispositions of Muslim commanders, about the internal politics of the Crusader states. Venice became the clearinghouse for military intelligence across the entire eastern Mediterranean. And it used this intelligence not to win battles. Venice preferred to avoid battles entirely, but to position its merchants and its diplomatic agents at the precise moment when opportunities opened. The Fondaco system expanded explosively during this period. By 1100 CE, Venice maintained permanent commercial settlements in Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Tyre, Acre, and a dozen lesser cities. And each of these settlements functioned as an intelligence station disguised as a warehouse. The men who staffed them were selected not merely for commercial acumen, but for social intelligence, the ability to befriend local officials, to learn local languages, to move comfortably between different cultural contexts, and to extract information in ways that never felt like interrogation. A Venetian merchant in 12th century Constantinople was expected to know not just the price of pepper, but the names of the emperor's advisors, the state of the imperial treasury, the identities of the eunuchs who controlled access to the palace, and the particular ambitions and vulnerabilities of each of them. This knowledge was regularly dispatched back to Venice in commercial letters, whose financial content was real and whose political content was encoded, not in sophisticated ciphers, but in the commercial language itself, where fluctuating prices and shipping delays could carry precise political meanings to a trained reader. The cultural achievement of this era was the creation of the great church of San Marco itself, completed in its current form in the 11th century, which was simultaneously a religious monument, a treasury, and a symbol of Venice's extraordinary capacity for cultural synthesis. The mosaics of San Marco drew on Byzantine techniques, Islamic geometric sensibility, and Western Christian iconography, creating a visual language that was recognizable to visitors from every civilization Venice traded with. And the creation of this synthesis was itself an act of intelligence gathering, a careful study of what different cultures valued and how they expressed their values in art. The Doge Domenico Contarini, who oversaw the completion of San Marco's major construction phase around 1071 CE, understood that a building which made every foreign visitor feel simultaneously at home and awed was a more powerful diplomatic tool than any fleet. When Byzantine emperors, Arab merchants, and German bishops all walked through the same golden interior and felt the spiritual grammar of their own traditions reflected back at them, they were already partially conquered. They already trusted the city that had so thoughtfully accommodated their sensibility. But the single greatest achievement of this era, the one that permanently altered the balance of Mediterranean power, was Venice's manipulation of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. This was intelligence warfare at a scale and sophistication that should have been impossible for a city of perhaps 100,000 people, and the man who orchestrated it was the Doge Enrico Dandolo, one of the most extraordinary political operators in European history. Dandolo was, by 1202 CE, nearly 90 years old and almost completely blind. But his blindness may have sharpened the other senses that matter in intelligence work, the ability to hear what people are not saying, to feel the texture of a political situation through its vibrations, to understand what people want badly enough to do almost anything to obtain it. When the leaders of the Fourth Crusade came to Venice to hire the fleet that would carry them to Egypt, the real target of the crusade, Dandolo listened to their requests, calculated their desperate need, and made them an offer that contained a hidden requirement they did not fully understand until it was too late to refuse. Venice would provide the ships and the supplies Dandolo offered, But the Crusaders would first need to help Venice recapture the Dalmatian city of Zara, which had recently shifted its allegiance away from Venice. The Crusaders agreed, though it meant attacking a Christian city, an act for which they were excommunicated by Pope Innocent III. Then, with Zara secured and the army now complicit in a morally compromising action that had already broken their relationship with the papacy, Dandolo executed the second stage of the plan. He redirected the entire crusade toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the richest city in the Christian world, and Venice's greatest commercial rival. The military logic he offered was elaborate and not entirely false. There was a Byzantine prince with a legitimate claim to the throne who needed Venetian help. But the real logic was simpler and had been built over decades of careful intelligence work. Venice knew Constantinople's defenses, knew the identities and prices of officials who could be bribed, knew the fault lines running through Byzantine politics, knew the exact combination of pressure and incentive that would cause the city's defenses to fail. In April 1204, Constantinople fell. The Crusaders sacked it, and Venice extracted its price, not the whole city. That would have required an army of occupation Venice did not want to maintain, but the commercial concessions, the harbors, the trade routes, the strategic islands of the Aegean. In a single campaign, Venice used intelligence that had been accumulated over generations to gut its greatest rival. And it did so while pointing an army of French knights at the door. Then, from the smoking ruins of Constantinople, a new Venice emerged, not larger in territory, but infinitely richer in commercial reach, and infinitely more confident in the power of information as a weapon of state. This instability continued until Venice faced a crisis that forced it to formalize what had previously been an informal practice. In 1310, a Venetian nobleman named Bagiamont Tiepolo led a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic and install himself as signor, a lord rather than a doge, a ruler by personal power rather than institutional consent. The conspiracy failed, bad weather disrupted the timing, and an old woman reportedly dropped a stone mortar from her window onto one of the conspirators, killing him and alerting the city. But its near success terrified the Venetian political class. If such a conspiracy could come so close to success, it could only be because the existing information networks were insufficient. There were conversations happening in Venice that the Doge did not know about. There were agreements being made in private that the state could not monitor. This was, to the Venetian mind, an existential threat, not because Tiepolo himself was so dangerous, but because the existence of unmonitored information within the Republic was, by definition, a vulnerability. The response was the creation, in 1310, of the Council of Ten, and it is at this moment that Venice's long tradition of informal intelligence gathering crystallized into something genuinely terrifying in its institutional elegance. The Council of Ten, actually consisting of 17 members when you counted the Doge and his 6 advisors, alongside the 10 elected members, was created initially as a temporary emergency committee to deal with the Typolo conspiracy. It was given almost unlimited authority to investigate, arrest, try, and execute anyone suspected of threatening the Republic, and its proceedings were conducted in complete secrecy. There were no public accusations, no open trials, no transparent evidence. The council received reports from informants, deliberated in locked rooms, and issued verdicts that could not be appealed. It was, from its first day of operation, a secret police, a domestic intelligence agency, and a court of last resort rolled into one institutional body. And it was so useful that the supposedly temporary emergency committee never went away, under the guidance of doges who understood its value. Most significantly, Doge Giovanni Soranzo, who ruled from 1312 to 1328 CE, and oversaw the institutionalization of the council's powers during its critical early decades. The Council of Ten evolved from a reactive security body into a proactive intelligence operation. It established, formally for the first time in European history, a system of paid informants operating within the city itself. Every neighborhood in Venice had individuals who reported to the council, not soldiers or official agents, but ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, priests, gondoliers, servants, wives, who were paid small amounts to report suspicious conversations, unusual gatherings, strange arrivals, or any behavior that deviated from the expected. The information these informants provided was not always accurate, was sometimes maliciously false, and occasionally destroyed innocent people. The council understood all of this and accepted it as the cost of comprehensive surveillance. The physical mechanism of this domestic intelligence system was one of the most chilling artifacts in Venetian history. The Bec di Leone, the mouths of the lion. These were stone faces carved into the walls of public buildings throughout Venice, their open mouths positioned to receive written denunciations. Any citizen could write an accusation against any other citizen and deposit it in the lion's mouth, and the Council of Ten would investigate. The Bec di Leone were brilliant instruments of social control because they did not merely gather information. They created a culture of informing. Every Venetian knew that their neighbors might be watching, might be writing, might be depositing a note that could result in a dawn arrest and a closed trial. This awareness changed behavior even more effectively than actual surveillance, because you could not be certain who was watching and who was not. The result was a city in which political conspiracy was genuinely difficult, not because dissent was impossible, but because the infrastructure of trust necessary to build a conspiracy was systematically corroded by the awareness that any conspirator might be an informant. The peak achievement of this era was not military, though Venice fought and generally won the wars it needed to fight, but architectural and archival. In 1334, under Doge Francesco Dandolo, Venice began the construction of the Palazzo Ducale in its current Gothic form. And this building was not merely a residence for the Doge or a meeting hall for the Senate. It was the physical embodiment of the Venetian information state. Its layout, carefully designed to separate different categories of knowledge, different levels of access, different corridors of power. The Doge's apartments were private, but supervised. The Council of 10 met in a chamber whose walls were painted by the greatest artists Venice could commission. Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto would later work here. Because beauty and terror were understood to be complementary instruments of power, the building's archives were already, by the mid-14th century, the most comprehensive state records in Europe, containing commercial data, diplomatic dispatches, intelligence reports, trial records, and financial accounts going back generations, all carefully organized and cross-referenced by a professional archival staff who understood that the ability to retrieve information quickly was itself a form of power. The foreign intelligence apparatus expanded in parallel with the domestic one. By 1350, Venice had developed the most sophisticated diplomatic service in Europe, and the key innovation was the mandatory written report, the relazioni, which every Venetian ambassador was required to submit upon completing his mission. These reports were not mere summaries of negotiations. They were comprehensive intelligence assessments covering the personal character of the ruler the ambassador had served at, the state of the country's economy, the disposition of its military, the identities and ambitions of the court's key figures, and any information the ambassador had gathered about third parties. The relazioni were gathered, bound, and archived in the ducal palace, and they constituted, over time, a library of intelligence about every significant political entity in the known world. A reference library that Venetian officials consulted before every major diplomatic or commercial decision, building on the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors in a way that gave Venice an informational advantage over every rival that was, in practice, almost impossible to overcome. But the fall trigger of this era came not from a foreign enemy or a domestic conspiracy, but from a biological catastrophe that no intelligence network, however sophisticated, could have predicted or prevented. Then, in 1347, the Black Death arrived in Venice aboard a trading ship from the Crimea, and within 2 years it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the city's population. The plague did not destroy the Venetian state. That state would prove more resilient than any human institution of the period had a right to be. But it killed enough skilled operators, enough trained diplomats, enough experienced merchants and archivists, that the system temporarily contracted, drawing inward, focused on survival rather than expansion. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death also, paradoxically, produced one of Venice's most enduring institutional innovations. The quarantine system, established in 1377, which required all ships arriving from plague areas to anchor for 40 days before unloading. This system, which gave us the word quarantine from the Italian quarantina, or 40 days, was presented as a public health measure. And it was, but it also served as an intelligence processing system, giving Venice 40 days to interrogate arriving crews, examine cargoes, and extract information from travelers before they dispersed into the city or the mainland. With the end of the Black Death's worst phase and the successful defense of the Republic through the War of Chioggia against Genoa in 1380, a war Venice nearly lost, survived through extraordinary diplomatic and financial mobilization, and ultimately won through a combination of military persistence and intelligence about Genoese strategic intentions. The stage was cleared for Venice's greatest era of institutional refinement. Then, from the ashes of the Chioggia War, a new and more confident Venice emerged, one that had faced extinction and survived, one that understood in its institutional bones that information was not merely useful, but existential, and one that was determined to build an intelligence architecture so comprehensive that no external power could ever again bring it to the edge of destruction. The century and a quarter between 1380 and 1509 was the true golden age of Venetian intelligence, the period in which the systems and practices that had been developing for 6 centuries were refined into their most perfect expression, and in which the effects of those systems on the wider world were most dramatically visible. The architect of this refined system was not a single genius, but a succession of doges and council members who each contributed specific innovations to a growing institutional framework. The Doge Antonio Venier, who ruled from 1382 to 1400 CE, oversaw a comprehensive reform of the ambassador reporting system, standardizing the format of the relazioni and requiring ambassadors to report not merely on the political situation, but on the physical and psychological characteristics of foreign rulers, their health, their temperament, their sexual habits, their financial anxieties, their family relationships, and any other personal information that might indicate potential leverage or vulnerability. Venier's innovation was to recognize that information about institutions was less actionable than information about individuals, because institutions do not make decisions, people do. And people are moved by very specific combinations of desire, fear, ambition, and pride that could be identified, mapped, and exploited if you knew enough about them. The relazioni of this period read, in translation, like the work of extraordinarily perceptive novelists, a Venetian ambassador at the court of the Duke of Milan in the 1390s, does not merely describe the political situation. He anatomizes Gian Galeazzo Visconti as a human being, noting his intelligence and his vanity, his genuine love of art, and his pathological suspicion of subordinates. The way he used elaborate courtesy to mask absolute ruthlessness, the specific fears that could be triggered to push him toward decisions he might otherwise resist. This quality of observation, precise, unsentimental, utterly focused on the actionable, was taught to Venetian diplomats as a formal skill, developed through practice and refined through institutional feedback. When an ambassador's report led to a successful outcome, the methods that had generated its key insights were studied and transmitted to the next generation of diplomatic trainees. By 1400, Venice had also formalized what historians later recognized as the first systematic use of cryptography in European state communications. The Council of Ten employed dedicated cipher secretaries, the secretari, who were among the most carefully vetted and monitored individuals in the entire Venetian system. These men designed the cipher systems used for sensitive diplomatic communications, maintained the codebooks, trained ambassadors in their use, and worked to break the cipher systems of foreign powers. The cipher secretary was himself subject to intense surveillance. The man who knows everyone's secrets must be the most watched man in the Republic, and the position came with extraordinary privileges and extraordinary constraints. A cipher secretary could not travel outside Venice without the council's permission. He could not meet with foreign nationals without supervision. His correspondence was monitored. His family members were, in effect, hostages to his loyalty. And when he died, his knowledge died with him, officially, though the institutional memory was carefully preserved in the archives that he had helped to maintain. The cultural achievement of this golden age was the flowering of Venetian art and architecture that made the city's physical beauty into an instrument of diplomatic power. Under the patronage of doges and merchants who understood that beauty conveyed authority, painters like Giovanni Bellini, architects like Pietro Lombardo, and sculptors of the first rank transformed Venice into the most visually magnificent city in Europe. The construction of the Doge's palace's eastern wing in the late 14th century, the facade of the Ca d'Oro, begun in 1421, under the patronage of the nobleman Marino Contarini, the completion of the Frari and Santi Giovanni e Paolo. These were not mere aesthetic achievements, they were strategic communications. Every dignitary who visited Venice and was overwhelmed by its beauty was being told, wordlessly but unmistakably, that this was a city of extraordinary resources, extraordinary competence, and extraordinary staying power. No city this beautiful, this permanent in its magnificence, could be a temporary phenomenon. Investing in Venice, trading with Venice, trusting Venice was obviously sensible. Look at what Venice had built. The art was an argument. The single greatest achievement of the Golden Age, however, was the formal institutionalization of the bailo system in Constantinople. The bailo, a word derived from the Latin baeulus, a carrier or steward, was Venice's permanent representative at the Ottoman court, and the position was, from the very beginning, explicitly understood by both parties to be simultaneously diplomatic and intelligence gathering in nature. The Ottomans tolerated and even encouraged this because they found Venetian information networks useful for their own purposes. The Venetians knew things about European courts that the Ottomans could not easily access, and the resulting relationship was one of the most productive intelligence exchanges in pre-modern history, with each party believing it was extracting more than it was giving. The bailo maintained in Constantinople a staff of young Venetian nobles who were, officially, learning Turkish and Byzantine Greek for commercial purposes. In practice, they were being trained as intelligence officers, spending years at the Ottoman court building relationships with Janissary commanders, learning the names and preferences of the Sultan's advisors, mapping the internal politics of the Sublime Porte, and sending regular detailed reports back to Venice through a courier network that ran almost without interruption for more than 3 centuries. Doge Francesco Foscari, who ruled from 1423 to 1457 CE, in the longest dogeship in Venetian history, oversaw the period of Venice's maximum territorial expansion on the Italian mainland, the terra firma policy, and this expansion was itself a product of intelligence work. Foscari did not simply send armies to conquer cities. He first sent agents to map the political landscape of each target, to identify the factions within each city that might welcome Venetian rule, or at least prefer it to the alternatives, to calculate the economic costs and benefits of different territorial configurations, and to assess the likely responses of Milan, Florence, and the papacy to Venetian expansion in specific directions. The terra firma campaigns succeeded not because Venetian armies were invincible. They were not, but because Venice chose its targets with extraordinary precision, striking where the political ground had been prepared by intelligence work, avoiding conflicts that its analytical system had identified as too costly or too likely to produce dangerous coalitions against it. Yet the fall trigger came precisely from this territorial success. However, the more Venice extended into the Italian mainland, the more it resembled a conventional land power, and the more the other land powers of Italy felt threatened. By 1508, the Pope Julius II, a man whose political intelligence was itself considerable, had assembled the League of Cambrai, a coalition specifically designed to strip Venice of its mainland possessions. The coalition included France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the papacy, and almost every other significant Italian power. And its formation represented a failure of Venetian intelligence at the highest level. Venice had, in its confidence, underestimated the ability of its rivals to coordinate against it. The agents in Rome, in Paris, in Vienna, in Madrid had not detected the conspiracy in time to disrupt it. And in 1509, at the Battle of Agnatalo, Venice suffered the worst military defeat in its history, losing most of its mainland territory in a single catastrophic afternoon. It was at this moment that the true test of the Venetian intelligence system arrived, not in its ability to prevent disaster, but in its ability to recover from one. With the fall of the terra firma territories following Agnatalo, the stage was cleared for a painful but ultimately transformative recalibration of Venetian strategy, one that would depend more heavily on intelligence than any previous adaptation, because Venice no longer had the military strength to fight its way back to dominance through force alone. What followed was 60 years of the most sophisticated diplomatic and intelligence maneuvering in European history, a period in which Venice simultaneously rebuilt its territorial position, resisted Ottoman expansion, managed its relationships with the new great powers emerging from the ruins of the medieval system, and refined its intelligence operations into something approaching a comprehensive theory of information power. The Doge who led Venice through the immediate crisis was Leonardo Loredan, who had been elected just months before Agnatalo in 1501, and who faced, in the summer of 1509, the almost incomprehensible task of governing a republic that had just lost most of its territory, faced invasion by multiple great powers, and was simultaneously engaged in trade negotiations with the Ottoman Empire that could not be interrupted without catastrophic commercial consequences. Loredan's response to this crisis is one of the most instructive examples of intelligence-based statecraft in the historical record. He did not attempt to fight all his enemies simultaneously. That was impossible. Instead, he directed the Council of Ten and the diplomatic service to identify the weakest links in the League of Cambrai, the parties whose commitment to the coalition was most fragile, most driven by specific and addressable grievances, most susceptible to alternative offers. The intelligence assessment identified France as the most dangerous enemy in the short term, but also the most likely to defect if its specific objectives could be met through negotiation rather than continued warfare. It identified Pope Julius II as a man whose hostility to Venice was real but ultimately tactical. He feared French power in Italy almost as much as he resented Venetian independence, and could be maneuvered into a reversal if approached correctly. Over the next 5 years, through a combination of military resilience, targeted bribes, strategic concessions, and brilliantly calibrated diplomatic approaches, informed by detailed intelligence, about each party's needs and fears. Venice peeled the League of Cambrai apart. By 1515, most of the mainland territories had been recovered, and Venice had demonstrated something that all the military victories in its history had not quite established: that a state with superior intelligence could survive defeats that would have destroyed any power relying on military strength alone. The lesson was not lost on the Venetian political class. The experience of Agnatalo and its aftermath permanently elevated the status of intelligence work within the Republic, and the Council of Ten's budget for intelligence operations increased dramatically in the years following the recovery. The spy network Venice, built between 1510 and 1570, was, by any measure, the most sophisticated in the world at the time. It operated on 3 distinct levels that were carefully separated to prevent any single failure from compromising the entire system. The first level was the official diplomatic service, the ambassadors and their staffs, who gathered intelligence through observation and conversation in the courts where they were accredited. The second level was the commercial network. The merchants, ship captains, and Fendaco managers, whose normal commercial activities provided cover for intelligence gathering, and whose information needs were genuine enough to justify their presence anywhere in the Mediterranean world. The third level, the most secret and most valuable, was the network of what the Council of Ten called its confidenti, individuals who were not Venetian nationals, who lived in foreign countries under no connection to Venice whatsoever, and who reported to Venetian handlers through complex cutout systems that prevented their identification, even if an intermediate link in the chain was compromised. The confidenti were the true innovation of the mature Venetian intelligence system, and their recruitment and management revealed a psychological sophistication that was centuries ahead of its time. Venice did not recruit primarily on the basis of ideology. There was no Venetian ideology that could appeal to a Milanese banker or an Ottoman scribe or a Spanish port official. It recruited on the basis of specific personal vulnerabilities: debt, ambition, fear, romantic entanglement, and the universal human desire to be part of something that felt significant and secret. Venetian handlers were trained to identify individuals in foreign courts whose specific vulnerabilities aligned with Venice's information needs, to approach them through intermediaries who appeared to have no Venetian connections, to develop relationships of apparent friendship and mutual benefit before making the actual recruitment pitch, and to manage the relationship afterward in ways that maintained the confidant's loyalty while minimizing the handler's exposure. The process was patient, precise, and deeply cynical about human nature, and it worked with a consistency that suggests its practitioners had developed genuine expertise in human psychology. The cultural achievement of this era was simultaneously the most beautiful and the most politically charged in Venetian history. The 16th century was the age of Titian, of Tintoretto, of Veronese, of Sansovino, and their work was inseparable from the intelligence and diplomatic agenda of the Republic. When Titian painted the portrait of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in 1533, he was not merely making art. He was executing a diplomatic commission, creating an image of the emperor that would be used to shape European perceptions of imperial power. And Titian's access to the imperial court was itself partly secured through Venetian diplomatic channels. Tintoretto's enormous cycle of paintings in the Doge's palace, covering the walls and ceilings of the Council of Ten's meeting chamber itself, were designed to create a specific psychological environment for the men who made state decisions in that room, surrounding them with images of Venetian virtue, divine favor, and historical achievement that reinforced the sense that their decisions were not merely political choices, but acts of historical and moral weight. The paintings were, in effect, a management tool, a carefully designed information environment intended to produce specific psychological states in the individuals who operated within it. Doge Alvise Mosnigo, who ruled from 1570 to 1577 CE, oversaw what was in many ways the climax of this intelligence era, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the great naval engagement in which a Christian coalition defeated the Ottoman fleet, ending the Turkish advance in the Western Mediterranean, was not merely a military triumph. It was an intelligence triumph. Venice's detailed knowledge of Ottoman naval dispositions, gathered through the Balo network in Constantinople, and through commercial contacts throughout the Aegean, contributed substantially to the coalition's tactical planning. The commander of the Christian fleet, Don John of Austria, relied on Venetian pilots, Venetian charts, and Venetian intelligence assessments to develop his battle plan and the specific formation that proved decisive. The Christian fleet's use of galleasses as fire platforms at the front of the battle line was a Venetian tactical innovation developed from intelligence about Ottoman combat doctrine gathered over decades of careful observation. But then, the Ottoman Empire was not destroyed by Lepanto. It was merely checked. Within a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet to pre-battle strength, demonstrating an industrial and organizational capacity that Venetian intelligence had known about, but perhaps not fully weighted in its assessments. The lesson was uncomfortable. Even perfect intelligence about an adversary's capabilities does not guarantee the ability to defeat those capabilities. Knowledge of power and possession of power are different things, and Venice, for all its informational advantages, was now operating in a world where the new great powers, the Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Spain, and later France, commanded resources that the Republic of a small Italian city could not match, regardless of how sophisticated its intelligence apparatus became. Then, from the aftermath of Lepanto, a paradox emerged that would define the next century of Venetian history. The battle that was supposed to secure Venice's position in the eastern Mediterranean actually accelerated the erosion of that position, because the military alliance that had made the victory possible, the Holy League involving Spain, Venice, and the papacy, was immediately undermined by the conflicting interests of its members in the peace that followed. Venice's intelligence services had anticipated this conflict of interests and had advised the Senate accordingly, recommending a negotiated peace with the Ottomans before the coalition collapsed. But the political pressure to maintain the alliance had temporarily overwhelmed the intelligence professionals' cooler assessment. The result was the loss of Cyprus in 1571, the very year of Lepanto, which Venice had controlled for a century, and which had been the eastern anchor of its commercial empire. The loss of Cyprus sent a shock through the Venetian intelligence system that produced its most significant structural reform since the creation of the Council of Ten. Under the direction of the Council's most capable members in the 1570s, a period when the actual names of the intelligence directors were carefully kept out of the official record, which is itself a testament to the system's paranoia. Venice reorganized its eastern Mediterranean network around a new assumption that direct commercial and political presence in Ottoman territory would become progressively more difficult, and that intelligence collection would increasingly need to rely on indirect methods, on third-party sources, on individuals who operated in spaces where Venetians could not go. The result was a massive expansion of the Confidenti network, a systematic effort to recruit Ottoman subjects, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and disaffected Turks, who could provide information from inside the imperial system without any visible connection to Venice. The Doge Niccolo de Pont, who ruled from 1578 to 1585 CE, presided over a period of uncomfortable peace with the Ottomans that was, in practice, an intensification of intelligence competition. The formal diplomatic relationship between Venice and Constantinople was maintained because both sides found it useful as a channel for communication. But beneath the surface of this official relationship, each side worked continuously to penetrate the other's decision-making processes. Venice's bailo in this period, Paolo Contarini, maintained a network of informants within the Ottoman court that reached from the Janissary Corps to the harem administration, a penetration so deep that Venice often received news of major Ottoman policy decisions before they were formally communicated to the Sultan's own provincial governors. The information flowing from Contarini's network included advance notice of military preparations, economic assessments of the Ottoman treasury's capacity for sustained warfare, and detailed personality assessments of the officials who shaped Ottoman policy toward Venice, assessments that the Council of Ten used to calibrate its negotiating positions with extraordinary precision. The domestic intelligence operations of this period reached their most sophisticated and most chilling expression in the so-called Capi dei Dice, the heads of the 10, who rotated on a monthly basis through the chairmanship of the Council's Executive Committee, and who maintained personal control of the most sensitive intelligence operations. These men had access to a network of informants that now covered not merely the city itself, but the entire terra firma, the overseas colonies, and the major European courts. And the information they received was processed through an analytical system that, while primitive by modern standards, was far in advance of anything any contemporary state maintained. Reports were compared against each other for consistency. Sources were evaluated for reliability based on their track record. Analytical conclusions were separated from raw intelligence and presented to decision makers in a format that distinguished between verified fact, credible assessment, and speculation. A distinction that most intelligence systems, including many modern ones, consistently fail to maintain. The cultural achievement of the late 16th and early 17th centuries was the flowering of Venetian music and theater, which served intelligence and diplomatic purposes that are only fully visible in retrospect. The musical academies of Venice, the Ospitali, which were originally hospitals for foundlings, but which became the most important musical institutions in Europe, trained performers who traveled throughout the continent, entering aristocratic courts and papal palaces as musicians, and returning with the kind of granular social intelligence that formal diplomatic missions could not gather. A Venetian musician at the court of Louis XIV in the 1660s was embedded in the daily life of the court in a way that no ambassador could be, present at meals, at entertainments, in the corridors where informal conversations happened. And the reports that these musicians, actors, and theatrical impresarios sent back to Venice were among the most valuable pieces of social intelligence the Council of 10 received. The Republic's investment in the arts was not merely aesthetic patronage. It was investment in a human intelligence network disguised as cultural exchange. The fall trigger of this era was the loss of Crete, yet in 1645, the Ottomans launched a massive campaign against Venice's greatest remaining eastern possession, the island of Crete, and the war that followed lasted 24 years. A grinding, catastrophic conflict that consumed Venice's treasury, its naval strength, and finally, in 1669, the island itself. The fall of Crete was not a failure of intelligence. Venice's analytical services had accurately predicted the Ottoman attack and had advised the Senate to strengthen the island's defenses years before the invasion. It was a failure of political will and economic capacity. Venice simply did not have the resources to defend Crete indefinitely against an adversary whose population and treasury were many times larger than its own, and no amount of superior intelligence could substitute for the battalions and ships that the Republic could not afford to build and maintain. The intelligence services knew the enemy was coming, knew roughly when, knew with whom, and the knowledge was not enough. Crete fell, and with it fell the last of Venice's great Eastern Empire. With the loss of Crete in 1669, the stage was cleared for the final phase of Venetian history, a period in which the Republic increasingly turned its intelligence apparatus inward, becoming more obsessively focused on domestic security as its external power contracted. It was at this moment, stripped of Crete, reduced from a great power to a medium one, increasingly surrounded by states whose military and economic resources dwarfed its own. That Venice made the fatal mistake of the aging institution. It began to confuse intelligence with control, information gathering with repression, and the monitoring of genuine threats with the persecution of perceived ones. The Council of Ten did not shrink in the late 17th and 18th centuries. If anything, it expanded its domestic surveillance operations, driven by an anxious awareness that the Republic's external vulnerabilities made internal stability more important than ever. But this expansion increasingly served the institutional interests of those who operated the system, rather than the genuine security interests of the Republic. And the result was a slow corruption of the intelligence mission that degraded both the quality of information and the quality of the decisions it was supposed to inform. The Doge Alvise Contarini, who presided over the exhausting final stages of the Cretan War and its aftermath in the 1670s, faced a republic whose confidence had been badly shaken and whose political culture was shifting from the bold pragmatism of the Golden Age toward a defensive conservatism that was the institutional equivalent of PTSD. The great innovations in intelligence practice, the analytical discipline, the separation of raw intelligence from assessed conclusions, the systematic cultivation of long-term human sources, were still present in the system, but they were increasingly deployed not toward the identification of genuine threats and opportunities, but toward the management of domestic political competition. The Bac de Leon, those stone faces that had once been instruments of genuine state security, were by the 18th century functioning primarily as mechanisms for noble families to persecute their rivals, and for personal vendettas to be prosecuted under the cover of state security concerns. The cultural achievement of this final era was the most spectacular and the most melancholy in Venetian history, because it was entirely disconnected from the political and strategic realities the Republic faced. The 18th century was the age of Vivaldi, of Tiepolo, of Canaletto, of the great carnival that turned Venice into the pleasure capital of Europe. Antonio Vivaldi, working from the Ospedale della Pietà as its musical director from 1703 onwards, composed over 500 concertos that expressed a joy and vitality utterly at odds with the political condition of the city that produced them. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo painted ceilings that soared with mythological confidence in the very decades when Venice was losing its last Mediterranean possessions and withdrawing from the trade routes that had been its lifeblood for 1,000 years. Canaletto's luminous views of the Grand Canal, bought by English aristocrats on their grand tour, created an image of Venice so beautiful and so timeless that it obscured the fundamental truth the paintings concealed. This was a city in the early stages of terminal decline, performing magnificence as a substitute for power. The art was not an argument anymore. It was a distraction. Doge Paolo Ranieri, who ruled from 1779 to 1789 CE, was among the last doges to understand that the Republic faced an existential challenge, and he spent his dogeship trying to reform the institutions that had calcified around the practice of intelligence without the spirit that had originally animated it. Ranieri attempted to modernize the Venetian diplomatic service, to introduce younger men trained in Enlightenment political thought, to reform the Council of Ten's procedures, to reduce their vulnerability to abuse by factional interests. His reforms were partially successful, partially resisted, and ultimately too late. The world that Venice had been designed to navigate, a world of competing city-states and regional kingdoms, whose machinations could be monitored and managed through a sophisticated network of human sources, was being replaced by a world of continental great powers, whose decisions were made in capitals, and courts that Venice could observe, but no longer influence. The fall trigger was Napoleon. However, in 1797, a 27-year-old Corsican general, whose meteoric rise Venice's intelligence services had tracked with increasing alarm, arrived in northern Italy and confronted the Republic with demands that were, in effect, a choice between survival with humiliation and resistance with destruction. Napoleon Bonaparte understood the symbolic and practical significance of Venice's intelligence apparatus. He explicitly commented on it in letters to the Directory, and his demands included the surrender of key Venetian officials and the opening of the secret archives. This demand for the archives was not incidental. Napoleon understood that the accumulated intelligence of 5 centuries was itself a strategic asset of the First Order, and he wanted it. The Venetian Senate, faced with Napoleon's army at its gates, and with a domestic population exhausted by war and squeezed by taxation, voted on May 12, 1797, to accept the peace terms. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, removed his ducal cap and handed it to his attendant with the words that reportedly still echo through Venetian historiography: "Take it, I will not be needing it again." The Republic that had lasted for over 1,000 years ended not with a battle, but with a vote, in a room full of old men who had run out of options. And the secret archives were loaded onto French wagons and shipped to Paris, where they would spend years being systematically analyzed by Napoleon's intelligence service. Then, from the wreckage of the Venetian Republic, something even stranger emerged, the mythology of Venice itself, which in death became more powerful as an idea than it had ever been as a living state. This instability, the political vacuum left by Venice's fall, the dispersal of its archives, the survival of its institutional knowledge in the heads of men who had operated the system, continued until the first historians began to understand what had actually existed. For decades after 1797, Venice was understood primarily as an aesthetic phenomenon, a city of extraordinary beauty and nostalgic romance, the Venice of Byron and Shelley and Turner, a place where the past had crystallized into architectural perfection. The intelligence dimension of its history was acknowledged, but not systematically examined, partly because the archives Napoleon had seized were not returned to Venice until 1815, damaged, partially catalogued, and stripped of some of the most sensitive material, and partly because the scholars of the 19th century were more interested in Venice as a cultural monument than as a functional intelligence state. It was not until the late 19th century when the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, the State Archive of Venice, began to be systematically catalogued that the true scale of what Venice had built became visible. The archive contained tens of thousands of relazioni, the diplomatic intelligence, reports submitted by ambassadors over 4 centuries. It contained the records of the Council of Ten's deliberations, the correspondence of the cipher secretaries, the accounts of the confidenti networks, and the accumulated intelligence assessments that had guided Venetian policy through every crisis from the Black Death to the fall of Crete. Reading these documents, the historians who first examined them experienced something close to shock. The sophistication of the analysis, the precision of the source evaluation, the systemic nature of the intelligence collection. These were not the practices of a pre-modern state feeling its way toward intelligence work. They were the practices of a mature intelligence bureaucracy, operating according to principles that would not be formally articulated in the intelligence theory literature. Until the mid-20th century, the Austro-Hungarian administration that controlled Venice from 1815 to 1866 was fully aware of the value of the Venetian intelligence legacy, and it made systematic efforts to both study the Venetian model and to prevent any revival of Venetian-style political organization that might threaten imperial authority. The Venetians themselves, under Austrian rule, engaged in a bitterly ironic reversal. The descendants of the men who had operated history's most sophisticated surveillance state now found themselves the subjects of an Austrian surveillance apparatus that, in certain respects, derived from the Venetian model. The Bac de Lyon were closed. The Austrians used their own methods, but the principle of comprehensive monitoring of political sentiment, systematic cultivation of informants within subject populations, and the use of intelligence to forestall political organization remained alive in the governance of 19th century Venice, a living inheritance from the Republic that had invented it. The unification of Italy in 1866, which brought Venice into the Kingdom of Italy after a plebiscite, began the process of integrating the Venetian archive into the Italian national historical consciousness. The scholars who worked in the archive in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, men like rank students, and later the great Italian archivists of the positivist tradition, produced editions and studies of the Relazioni and Council of 10 records that made the Venetian intelligence legacy available to a wider academic audience. But it was the catastrophe of the First and Second World Wars that gave the Venetian model its most significant modern influence, because intelligence professionals in the newly established national intelligence services of the 20th century, the British Secret Intelligence Service, the American OSS, and later CIA, the Soviet NKVD, studied the Venetian precedents when designing their own systems. The principle of separating intelligence collection from analysis, the emphasis on long-term human source development, the use of commercial cover for intelligence operations, the requirement for systematic written reporting by field operatives. These Venetian practices appeared, often without explicit attribution, in the founding documents and operational protocols of modern intelligence agencies. The period of Italian fascism brought Venice's intelligence heritage into an uncomfortable proximity with totalitarian surveillance. Mussolini's regime, which ruled from 1922 to 1943, maintained a domestic intelligence apparatus, the OVRA, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, whose methods bore unmistakable structural resemblances to the Council of Ten's domestic operations, with informant networks, secret trials, and the systematic use of fear to prevent political organization. Whether this resemblance was deliberate borrowing or parallel institutional evolution is debated by historians, but the functional similarities are striking enough to suggest that the Venetian model, available in the Italian historical consciousness through centuries of cultural transmission, shaped the form that fascist repression took in the cities of the North. Venice itself, during the fascist period, was simultaneously celebrated as a national monument and quietly purged of Jewish residents who had been part of the city's commercial and intellectual life since the establishment of the Venetian ghetto in 1516. The same ghetto that the Republic had used with characteristic Venetian pragmatism as both a restriction and a commercial resource, employing Jewish merchants as commercial agents in Muslim countries where Christian Venetians could not operate, while simultaneously taxing them at punitive rates and requiring them to wear identifying marks in the city itself. The German occupation of northern Italy from 1943 to 1945 brought to Venice a surveillance apparatus of genuinely totalitarian modernity. Radio intercepts, systematic torture, the Gestapo methods that were more brutally efficient than any pre-modern intelligence system, and the Venetian resistance, which was real and sustained, and is inadequately remembered in the historical literature, operated in full knowledge of the surveillance environment they faced. The partisans of the Veneto operated in small cells precisely because they understood, intuitively or through study of their own history, that the organizational structure least vulnerable to surveillance was the one that minimized the information any single individual possessed about the wider network. The Venetian intelligence tradition had given its people, at some deep cultural level, an understanding of how surveillance systems work, and therefore how to evade them. A knowledge that proved practically useful in the deadliest possible circumstances. The post-war period transformed Venice from an active political capital into an icon of cultural heritage, and the intelligence dimension of its history became primarily an academic concern rather than a living practice. The establishment of the Italian Republic in 1946, the integration of Italy into NATO in 1949, and the subsequent development of Italian intelligence services within the Cold War framework meant that Venice's intelligence legacy was absorbed into a national and then international system rather than maintained as a specifically Venetian institution. The Archivio di Stato continued its work of cataloging, preserving, and making available the records of the Republic, and the quality of scholarship on Venetian intelligence history improved dramatically in the second half of the 20th century, with historians like Donald Queller, Frederick Lane, and later Paolo Preto producing studies of the Venetian diplomatic and intelligence systems that established their significance in the wider history of statecraft. The UNESCO decision in 1987 to designate Venice and its lagoon a World Heritage Site was in one sense the final institutionalization of Venice's transformation from active state to cultural monument. The recognition that what Venice represented was now primarily an aesthetic and historical value rather than a political one. But this designation also reflected something that the UNESCO committee perhaps did not fully intend: the recognition that the information environment Venice had created, the physical city, the canal system, the architecture, the archive, constituted a kind of library in itself, a record of how a small state with limited physical resources used information as its primary instrument of power, and survived for over a millennium in conditions that should have destroyed it within generations. The modern city of Venice faces, in the 21st century, threats that its intelligence services would have recognized as structurally familiar, even if the specific forms are novel. The Acqua Alta, the high water events that flood the historic city with increasing frequency due to climate change and the subsidence of the lagoon, represents an existential threat to the physical infrastructure that embodies the Venetian historical memory. The MOSE project, the system of flood barriers begun in 2003 and finally activated in 2020 after 17 years of construction, and one of the largest public corruption scandals in Italian history, was itself a story of information failure. The systematic concealment of cost overruns, technical problems, and bribery from public scrutiny by a network of corrupt contractors and officials. A reminder that the Bac di Leone are closed, and that the institutional memory of the surveillance state that built them has faded to the point where such corruption could be sustained for 2 decades before exposure. The Venetian intelligence state, at its height, would have known about the MOSE corruption within months. The modern Italian state, with all its technological advantages, took 17 years. The cultural survival of Venice in the modern era depends, paradoxically, on tourism. The millions of visitors who flood the city each year to experience the physical beauty that the Republic commissioned as an instrument of diplomatic power. But this tourism, which has made Venice the most visited city per resident in the world, also threatens the social fabric that once made it a living community. The permanent population of the historic center has declined from a peak of around 175,000 in the mid-20th century to fewer than 50,000 today, as locals are priced out by the conversion of residential properties into tourist accommodation, and the economic structure shifts entirely toward visitor services. The city that once produced the world's most sophisticated intelligence professionals, the ambassadors and cipher secretaries and confidenti handlers who understood the deepest mechanisms of power. That city is in danger of becoming a theme park of its own past, beautiful and hollow, populated by tourists rather than citizens. The last irony of Venice's intelligence legacy is that the information now flowing through the city is not diplomatic dispatches carried by galleys or coded letters sent by ambassadors. It is Instagram posts and TripAdvisor reviews, a flood of essentially meaningless data that generates no actionable intelligence about anything that matters, processed by no Council of 10, but only by the algorithms of corporations whose headquarters are on the other side of the planet. And yet the Venetian archive survives in the Frari complex, in the great Gothic church that once received the artistic patronage of the Republic's most powerful men. The Archivio di Stato di Venezia holds in its vaults the accumulated intelligence of 1,000 years. The relazioni of ambassadors who sat at the courts of sultans and emperors, the deliberations of the Council of 10 as it decided the fates of men and nations, the coded correspondence of cipher secretaries, the denunciations deposited in the mouths of stone lions, the recruitment files of confidenti who risked their lives to send information across hostile territory, These documents are available to any scholar who applies for access. They are cataloged, partially digitized, treated with archival reverence. They sit in a deconsecrated monastery in a city that no longer makes policy based on what they represent. Their operational secrets reduced to historical curiosities. Their tradecraft admired from a distance rather than employed, but the principles they embody. That information is power. That the systematic collection and analysis of intelligence provides decisive advantage to those who practice it seriously. That the combination of human source development, communication security, and analytical discipline can allow a small state to compete with powers many times its size. Those principles are not historical curiosities at all. They are the operating assumptions of every serious intelligence service in the world today. And the Venetian Republic, which developed and refined them over 5 centuries of practice, did so without computers, without telecommunications, without satellites, without any of the technological advantages that modern intelligence agencies take for granted. What Venice had, instead of technology, was institutional memory, the capacity to learn from experience, to preserve that learning in archives and training protocols, and to transmit it across generations in a form that remained practically applicable. That institutional memory, distributed now across the scholarship that has recovered and analyzed the Venetian record, remains one of the most instructive case studies in the history of statecraft. And the scholars who study it find, repeatedly, that the questions Venice faced and the answers it developed are not as distant from the present as the gondolas and marble might suggest. The intelligence that once flowed through the canals of Venice now flows through fiber optic cables and encrypted messaging platforms, processed by agencies whose names have changed, but whose mission, to know before others know, to understand before others understand, to act on information that adversaries do not possess, would have been immediately recognizable to the men who designed the Relazini system, who trained the Belos staff in Constantinople, who built the Bac de Leon into the walls of a city that believed, with justification, that knowing everything was the only reliable substitute for being able to defeat everyone. Venice fell. The archives survived. And somewhere in the methodology of every modern intelligence service that has ever studied its records, the Council of 10 still meets. The thread connecting medieval Venice to the intelligence controversies of the 21st century is not metaphorical. It is institutional, traceable through specific lineages of practice and principle that passed from the Venetian system into the emerging intelligence cultures of early modern Europe, and from there into the professional intelligence agencies that defined the 20th century's geopolitical competition. When the British Secret Intelligence Service formalized its requirement for written agent reports in the early 20th century, it was replicating a Venetian practice 4 centuries old, when the OSS, the American Wartime Intelligence Agency, that became the CIA, established its system of station chiefs in foreign capitals who managed both official liaison relationships and unofficial human source networks. It was implementing, without necessarily knowing it, the functional model of the Venetian Bailo. When modern intelligence doctrine distinguishes between intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, and intelligence operations, between gathering information, assessing its significance, and acting on it, it is articulating a distinction that the Council of Ten's Secretariat had developed by practice and institutional refinement into a working system by the early 16th century. The specific debates that occupy contemporary intelligence communities, the tension between mass surveillance and targeted human intelligence, the difficulty of distinguishing genuine threats from false positives in a system flooded with low-quality information, the corruption of intelligence analysis by political pressure, the ethical boundaries of source recruitment and handling. All of these debates have precise Venetian precursors, played out in the deliberations of the Council of Ten and the careers of the men and women who operated its system. The Bac de Lyon generated false denunciations that destroyed innocent people, and the Council knew it and accepted it as a cost of comprehensive surveillance. A calculation that modern debates about mass data collection replay in digital form. The reliance on confidenti, whose loyalty was purchased, rather than principled, created constant uncertainty about the reliability of the intelligence they provided. A problem that case officers in modern intelligence agencies describe in strikingly similar terms: the political pressure on ambassadors to tell the Senate what it wanted to hear rather than what they actually observed corrupted the intelligence product in ways that the analytical system struggled to detect. A failure mode that intelligence professionals call the politicization of intelligence, and that has distorted the assessments of every major intelligence service in every significant crisis of the last century. The city of Venice today hosts conferences on European security, receives delegations of scholars studying the archival record of its republic, and watches its lagoon rise with water that reflects the consequences of decisions made in the capitals of industrial nations, whose information environments are incomparably richer, and whose political wisdom appears no greater than that of the men who assembled in the Council of Ten and made decisions that altered the fate of empires. The golden horses of San Marco, looted from Constantinople in 1204, removed to Paris by Napoleon in 1797, returned in 1815, moved to the Museum of San Marco in 1980 to protect them from pollution, stand as the most literal possible emblem of the Venetian intelligence story. Objects of incalculable value, repeatedly seized by whoever held power, surviving every transfer, enduring in their specific gravity beyond the succession of states that claimed to own them. The information Venice gathered and preserved in its archives has undergone similar transfers, similar seizures, similar appropriations by successor powers, and it too has survived, patient in its stone repository by the Grand Canal, waiting for the scholars and the intelligence professionals who will continue to extract from it the lessons that 1,000 years of practice refined, but never fully exhausted. The story of Venice's forbidden library, the archive that held the secrets of empires, the network that whispered across the known world, the council of shadows that turned information into sovereignty, did not end in 1797, when the last Doge removed his cap and the French soldiers began loading the archive onto their wagons. It ended, if it ended at all, only when the last person who understood what those documents represented and what principles they embodied stopped drawing on that understanding to make decisions in the present. And given that you are watching this video and thinking about these things, and perhaps even feeling the particular pull that intelligence history exercises on certain kinds of minds, the possibility that it has ended at all remains, to say the least, very much an open question.